So, we are very happy to have with us Beth Atkin, the author of Voices from the Streets. She's going to talk to us for a while. I think she even has a special guest to introduce us to during her talk. And afterwards, she'll hang around, sign books for us, answer any questions you might have. Help me welcome her.
Thanks, and thanks for coming. Luckily, there's a lot of familiar faces, which is great, and that's because I grew up down here, and which is one of the reasons why there's a couple young people that I chose to be in this book from this area. And mostly I think what I want to do is tell you a little bit about why I did this book, how it came about, and then I'd like to read chapters from it because it's really the kids' viewpoint and their words that I think makes this book as strong as it is. And then I also think really the best way to find out about the book and the information is to ask me questions. So I think I'll probably take about 20 minutes when I'm finished to do that. To tell you a little bit about myself, I actually was trained as a photographer and became a writer when I worked on my first book, which was about the children of migrant farm workers. And the reason why that's important is that during the research of that book, I met a young man who I chose to be one of the chapters, and he was in a gang. And at the time I was living in Salinas, California, and I learned a great deal from him, and he pretty much broke down all the stereotypes that I had ever seen in the media about gang members. So his chapter in that book was about growing up in a farm worker family, coming from a very difficult background, joining a gang because of protection, and then pretty much having it ruin his ability to go on in his future, although later he did earn his GED. So this was back in 1989. I started that research, and it sort of gave me what I think is an honest term of obsession about trying to do something to help kids that were in gangs. And after I finished that book, I proposed this book, Voices from the Streets, and the purpose was to sort of show people a different side of gang life, and most importantly, a hopeful side. I had seen a tremendous amount in the media about gang members, but very little except sparse newspaper articles on how kids got out of gangs. And my feeling is that when you're covering a difficult topic, it's great to hear the accurate and important information, but if you don't have any hope involved, it's very hard to get your audience to want to really do anything to help the people. So that was my point of view, and I decided to work only with former gang members. So that's why it's former gang members tell their stories. There's 9 people interviewed in this book. They're between the ages of 11 and 22. There's 5 ethnicities. It takes place in 8 different locations in America. And I also did that because generally when you read in the media, you hear about the Bloods and the Crips in either LA or Chicago, or if you're in California, you hear about the Norteños and the Sureños, which probably on the East Coast you've never even heard of that. And the gang problem has really spread all over the country to all kinds of rural areas. All ethnicities are involved. And I really thought that people had stereotyped gang members, and so I wanted to do something about that. During the process of doing this book, I found out a great deal that I did not learn in my original research. And as a writer, it's very difficult to stop your research and include what you've learned from the young people, because if you've been researching for 4 years about, for instance, joining a gang because of discrimination, and then you find out a new form of discrimination, you have to redo your research, your interviewing process, and what have you. But I thought that these kids' stories, if they were somewhat different, would also inform the public about new things that were going on that nobody had heard about. So what I'd like to do is read part of a chapter of a young man who surprised me a great deal when I met him. And he actually grew up in Boston. I did quite a bit of work in Boston in about 3 different areas. And he actually joined a gang for one of the sort of what you would call well-documented reasons of joining gangs. In fact, this is one of the reasons that people have been joining gangs from the early 1700s. I don't know how many people know that that's how long gangs have actually existed. And one of the prime reasons for joining gangs during that time was because of discrimination and inability to get a job. During that time, the first people that were discriminated against, which were the Irish, and very extremely so. And so, although this young man comes from Boston, which has a huge Irish population, and there is a young man in this book who is Irish, the chapter I'm going to read is about a Cambodian young man. And I'm going to read a little bit about, the way the book is broken up is there's statistical blurbs at the beginning of each chapter, which gives you a very small amount of research about the topic that the chapter covers. For instance, Sarome Fong, which I'm going to read, has a chapter on discrimination. There's a bit of statistical information at the beginning, and then his voice covers the rest of the chapter. At the opening of his chapter, what I'm very proud of is that in each chapter is included either personal writing from the young person involved or from an intervention program that was covered in the book as well. And this book, which you probably have never seen, is a poem in Khmer, which is handwritten by the young man whose chapter it's about, which is very unusual for a large national publisher to put in a bilingual poem. So this is how his chapter begins, then I'll read a little bit about him. Ethnicity has been a motivation for membership, recruitment, and protection in gangs throughout the U.S. through the late 1700s, which I just told you about. When Irish immigrants in Boston and New York banded together because they could not find work due to discrimination. In the mid-1800s, numerous youth gangs were active in Philadelphia and Chinese gangs emerged in California. By the 1920s, Mexican gangs were prolific in Los Angeles. When immigrant parents do not find a way to adapt to society, their children are left to find their own solutions. About 10 million immigrants entered the U.S. in the last decade, more than in any 10-year period in American history. At least 31.8 million people in the U.S. speak a language other than English at home, and in urban public schools, 1/3 of children speak a foreign language. Joining gangs is one way for immigrant kids to find a sense of their language, identity, and culture, which they may have left behind in their birth countries. So the purpose of this chapter is talked about a little bit at the beginning. And within the chapter, Sarome starts to speak about why he joined a gang, but most importantly, he talks about why he got out, which is really, as I said, the focus of the book. I'm going to read you a little bit of the beginning of his chapter and his end. And when I first interviewed him, I'm embarrassed to say I had heard a little bit about the Khmer Rouge and the war that had gone on in Cambodia, but very little. And within about 3 weeks, I was pretty well educated on the subject. I was also very horrified by what he told me because he was in Khmer Rouge camps, and it started to make a little more sense to me why there was a chance that this young man had joined the gang. So I'm going to read you a little bit about his story. We had a wonderful family when we first came to the U.S. The day my family arrived here was the day of my life. We had no choice but to leave my country. There was war in Cambodia. There was a communist kind of thing. People were getting killed. You didn't have food. The Khmer Rouge thing, it was supposed to be a revolution to help people, but instead it was to kill the people. My family was separated during the war. My brother Saran, the oldest one, was forced to join the Khmer Rouge army to fight. We lost him in 1975, then in 1979 we found him. He blanked out once because he lost a lot of blood, so all I was doing was crying out and calling to him. I left my country in 1979. We didn't come right to Cambodia, we were in 2 Thai camps. I was there for about 5 years. Then we went to the Philippines, then we got here. My parents and some other folks would not talk about what happened in Cambodia. They just keep it to themselves. That's why they get crazy. Our family didn't talk about it. I don't talk to anybody. My father don't talk to anybody. Then they ended up slowly disintegrating. The family broke apart. My father worked 2 jobs when we came here. She worked really hard trying to save money for us to go to school. All she wanted was my father to stay home, go to school, and learn some English. And he doesn't do that. He's an alcoholic. My father went out to get drunk and gamble and took all the money that my mother was trying to save. It was about $40,000, and he wasted it all in 6 months. And the reason why I include all this information and when I'm reading it to you now is I don't think people really quite get why a young person would join a gang. Well, I think when you start to read a little bit about the background of this young person, it makes a little more sense. And it doesn't seem like such a horrendous, awful thing to do when you see the family background. Just comes a time when a lot of things hit me at once. I got problems at home. My mother had it with my father. My parents don't get along with each other. I didn't talk to anybody about the problems at home because it was an Asian traditional kind of thing. I asked my mom, why is everything this way? And I clearly remember my mother said, when you get older, you'll understand. That's when I started to hang out with guys in my neighborhood. It started out as a racial thing. You come to this country, people look at you differently, treat you like dirt. It makes you feel hopeless. So where do people turn? Like me, I turned to a gang. These guys grew up in the same place and had the same experience. I'm sure they got called gook also. We're all in the same boat. We're just kids hanging out. I felt like I got lost between two identities when I got involved in the gang. Your family rejects you when you join the gang, and then you go out on the street and society rejects you. You're living in an American society, so you try to go with the flow, but in Cambodian culture, for example, you can't touch my head unless you're older than me. And if I go outside, people will say, hey, Sarome, and tap my head. And so the bond with the gang becomes stronger, and I guess the identity with it. We were like a family, a government, a rule, just a system for ourselves. We're going to tell you that we're here and we're staying. I can't sell drugs because I'm not into drugs, so I have to do what we did. It's about like taking care of your family. So then he goes on to talk about his gang involvement, the different things he did, like home invasions, the people that got shot, etc., etc. And one of the things I try to do in this book is everything that the kids say I have recorded, but information that I think people have heard a tremendous amount about, I don't exclude, but I don't think is necessary to put in 100 times. For instance, how many drive-bys this young person witnessed. I think plenty of people have heard about them. I think it's important to know that they can see that this person was involved, but I don't think that it has to be told again and again. And mostly it's not my point of view, it's Sarome's point of view. So then, the way that Sarome got out of a gang is that he joined an intervention program, and the main person that helped him was a woman named Molly Baldwin, who lives in a suburb of Boston named Chelsea. And so one of the main things he says, which is kind of some language that I think I'll exclude, is I was in a lot of trouble when I met Molly. My friend was going to the program and she told Molly about me, and she came to look at me. I didn't put my trust on her right away because there were people that had tried to help me before, but it didn't work. But then she kept showing up on the street in the middle of the night while I was drinking a 40. That's a 40-ounce bottle of beer. I really hated her at this time. I didn't think she was helping me. One of the things that she helped, but she did do, is she persevered. So then he finishes school. He ends up going on to become a teacher at the program that he enrolled in. He teaches kickboxing, he helps young people, and eventually he graduates from high school. And now he's still working in that program. He has 2 little boys, he's married, and he's changed his life totally. During this chapter, when I was interviewing him on and off for a year and a half, he was under indictment for assault with a deadly weapon. I couldn't speak to him about this, and the charges were dropped during the last interview in this book. And then I'd just like to read you the last part of his chapter, which is really what I try to bring out when I did this, was the positive and why these kids have gotten out of gangs. I really feel fortunate to be here, just to live, to breathe the air every day, to see my family and my kid. I appreciate some part of my life. When I was in the gang, I was in what you call the fast lane, and I like quiet places, not so much city life. I want to see a sunset in Cambodia again and take my family back there. I want my son to see what I don't see, because my country used to be peaceful before the war. But I think if I go to Cambodia right now, I'd be happy and feel more strong. I think I missed a part of my life and a piece of me somewhere, and I want to get that piece. I tell Molly and Elizabeth, that's his wife, I want to go to college and start writing. And the message, if I was going to write my own book, is that you don't have to be Asian to face this kind of problem with gangs. You don't have to be black or white or Latino. It could be anybody who can relate to the story I'm telling. I would want to get across there is always a choice for people who are involved in a gang. Don't wait until it's too deep, like kill 20 people and go to jail and never get out. Wake up and think about yourself and where the hell you are right now. See people like me, see people like Molly inspire people like me. And it takes, what's the word? It takes a whole village to raise one child. It's true, I'm not one kid. So that's Sarome's chapter, and he's in the part of the book that's sort of focused more on getting into gangs. And the second part of the book is focused a little more on getting out of gangs. And the last chapter, which is actually, I think, pretty interesting, is a father and son, both African American. The father was in a gang in the 1950s. The son is a street worker and lives in the neighborhood which his father took him out of when he was a baby. He moved his son to San Jose from Boston. His son graduated from college, went back to Boston, and works on the same streets where his father grew up, and his father is also an outreach worker as well. So the two of them discuss how things have changed and how some things have stayed the same and what intervention programs work and which don't. And that's the last chapter in the book. Now, the next part that I would like to read from is from a young girl whose name has been changed, so I actually might slip because she's sitting right here. And she's going to come up with me, and I'm going to introduce her. In the book, her name is Elena Rojas, and I'd like you to welcome her. Right here. So, people like Elena are why I did this book. They're awfully inspiring to see what they've gone through and how they've changed their lives. And I'm going to read a little bit about the blurb, as I said, so you'll know a little bit about why I chose Elena to be in the book. Her chapter is called Really Protected. Teenagers and children often join gangs for protection. They want to be able to walk down the street or go to school without being afraid or harassed. With 15 American children killed by handguns each day, kids' lives are exposed to more violence than ever before. Today, many children see their friends, their family members, or strangers abused, shot, stabbed, or arrested, often from gang violence. So when I went to do this chapter, I had this big heading in my mind: find a kid who got out of a gang eventually, but originally joined for protection. I knew all the standard sort of reasons why, just read you some of them. Then I got introduced to Elena, and she told me a new reason. And Elena Rojas, which is a pseudonym, belonged to the gang TNS, Take No Shit, which she joined for protection. She lives in Miami, Florida with her Cuban-born mother, who's sitting right here, and stepfather and babysitter sister. She attends Little Havana Institute, which she no longer attends, and an alternative school for at-risk youths. Her mother did not know she was in a gang until she was interviewed for this book. I'm going to read a little bit of the chapter, and then I'm going to let Elena finish, and then you guys can ask some questions. And you'll find out the different reason why she joined for protection. You ready to read? You want to wait? I've known about gangs since I was little because I never lived in a good neighborhood. Then it wasn't as bad, you know. Gang members would stick to their own neighborhood and not go over and look for a fight. So I learned a lot about the street on my own, and then from my mom, you know. She was raised in a tough neighborhood, so she told me a lot. My mom is very open with me, as I usually am with her. When she was young, she did a lot of drugs. She told me since I was 8. She said, in case anybody comes up and tells you this about your mother, you already know. When she tells me, like when she was in jail for 7 months because of the drugs, it helps me understand the way I should be. My aunt and grandmother helped her out of doing drugs, and by the time I was born, she had been clean for a couple years. I knew I had everything I needed to survive, but there's many reasons why people join gangs, like they're getting picked on. I have an acquaintance who was getting picked on and that kept saying, you're going to get your ass beat, so he joined the rival gang. sometimes you're just having problems with somebody. I'm a good example that you don't always join a gang because of your family. Sounds pretty smart, huh? It was just because of this one guy, my boyfriend Caesar, I joined TNS. He was a sweet talker, and that works with me. He was 16 when we were going out, and I was 12. He wasn't in a gang, but he hung out on the street, and I cared about him. But whenever he would get mad, he took it out on me. Not just beating me up, but screaming at me, hurting my feelings and calling me names. He would hit me in front of my friends, sometimes by mistake. They would tell him to back off and say that's not right, and then he'd leave me alone. I didn't want to tell my mom about Caesar because I knew she would tell me to break up with him. She didn't suspect anything because she knew I got in fights if someone pushed me and got on my nerves. Finally, I told her, and she said it's better you're not with him. I was tired of being picked on. When I hung out with other people in the gang before I was in it, I felt safe. We were all in classes together. I thought the girls from the gang could give me good advice because they knew more about, like, trouble. I could have just had the gang protect me because they knew me and they would, but I wanted them to really, really protect me, and I wanted to be feared. So then she goes on and talks about getting in the gang. I don't know if people here know the details, but getting into a gang is very difficult. You either get what's called beaten in, walked in, and there's also getting sexed in. And actually the definitions are in the back of this book, but basically when you get beat in is what you're going to hear right now, which is what Elena went through. I got walked into TNS, which is another word for it. You can slide in if you have a big brother or sister, and that's in the gang. I got walked in by a line of girls. You walk down the line from one to the other, and they stand 5 feet away from each other. They beat me up for 4 minutes. It went fine. Just my back was bruised and 3 ribs. They don't do anything to your face, so your parents don't know. I guess it wasn't as scary for me as for most people because I was used to it from my boyfriend. And then Elena talks about how she was in the gang, what she did when she was in it, and then she ended up getting into a school called the Little Havana Institute. And her mother helped her get into that school and said, so she got me into the Little Havana Institute. I probably wouldn't have gone back to the gang, but this school helped me make up my mind to not go back. My Spanish teacher there is the first one who knew I was in the gang, and he was the only one who knew except for Martha Young. She's my principal. I can talk to Martha about my problems. I had told her about my boyfriend and TNS. Here at the school, they tell you, look, if you get good grades, you could go places, go to college, and have special classes that help you, which actually did work for her. And now I'm going to let her read some of her chapter instead of me. I think it sounds better. Get close to me.
If I could tell someone, I would tell someone, if you get a chance to be in a gang, don't do it. First of all, it will ruin your life. You never know if you're going to get shot or stabbed, if you're going to die or get put in jail. You have to be very strong to go through what people go through in a gang. Just stay in school, study a lot. Get called a nerd as many times as you have to, but stay out of a gang. I wish they could get out of gangs all over the United States. No, I wish they could get the gangs all over the United States and put them in a camp together. Because most of the time when people get killed, it's one gang against another. So they would have to live together for at least a couple of years and learn how to get along.
Can you believe this is you?
You know, most adults know more about life than they give. But my mom gives me an idea that I can trust her. She needs me to be the person I am inside, who loves children and helping people. When she gives me a straight advice, I use it. Everything goes well, but like with joining a gang, I did what I wanted for myself. If I didn't have her, I'd still probably be in juvenile or in a gang. So I would like to tell all the parents, first look at the mistakes they've made in their lives and give their children as much advice or understanding as they can. Listen to them because kids like to be listened to. What most kids need is love and attention and someone to care for them. I have that.
So that's her chapter. The other chapters in this book, there's another young girl from Broward County who was in a program called The Starting Place. There's a young man in Boston who actually got out of gangs by becoming involved in the church. There's a Mexican-American boy who at about 17 got out of gangs and started a rival football team which got gangs together to learn how to relate on the football field, which actually ended up working, except the first time they got together there was a shootout. But then it actually improved after that. There's a young, as I mentioned, a young Irish-American young boy who joined just because everybody in his neighborhood did. So there's a pretty large variety. As I said, it took place in a lot of different cities, and each young person talks about really who or what helped them. In Elena's case, it was her school and her mother who had her there. And I think really the point of this book and the point for people to hopefully learn is that persevering and sticking it out with a young person can really help. Even though it may look like they're doing drugs, they're doing something criminal, they're doing drive-bys, if they have attention and somebody around to care for them, with hard work, I think they do get out. Every single young person in this book has stayed out of gangs. It's not always the case, unfortunately, but it's primarily, I would say, the case because the people that have helped them are constantly following through. There's one young person who's been helped since the age of 9 all the way through the age of 22. His mother was a coke addict from when he was a little kid. That's a long period of time to stick with a young person, but he is now helping kids on the street. He walks down the street and pulls gang kids off the street and is giving back, and that's what 70% of the kids are doing now. They're helping other gang kids. So that's pretty much the message of the book, and I could go on because I was very involved in doing this, and it meant a great deal to me, but I'd prefer to answer any questions, and I think Elena would probably be happy to as well.
I have a question. Is it difficult to get out of the gang?
In most situations it is, because like if you get walked in, you have to get walked out, which means that you have to get beat again. Sometimes it's hard because the gang doesn't want you to get out, and they'll try anything to persuade you to stay in, and if they can't persuade you, they'll do something bad to you and show you, if you don't stay in, this is gonna happen. So yeah, in most cases it is.
Sometimes it's, for Elena, there's actually a little bit in her chapter that talks about that, and she asked permission and it went okay. I think for some gang members who have been in a long time or also in extremely hardcore gangs, people do get killed when they get out. Often they just, one way to get out is they grow up, they have a family, and eventually the gang members respect that. And there's a chapter actually in the book on a young girl who got out of the gang because she had a baby. And 80% of the girls in her gang were all left alone, but the reason is they all were pregnant and they all had children. So then that's something that gang members respect, and they leave you alone. So that's the answer. Yes, it is. That's it?
What are you doing now?
Now I go to public school. I'm going to private school. I have a whole new group of friends, a whole new attitude, like a whole new way of life. I'm into a lot of after-school activities. Now I'm getting into photography. I'm enjoying, thanks to a friend.
And she has to wear school uniform now.
And I have to wear school uniform, so.
How old are you?
Now I'm 15.
How'd you find each other?
I actually found Elena through a woman named Yolanda Mancia, who works with the violence prevention program at University of Miami, who I got to from somebody at Legal Services of Greater Miami, who I found through an attorney who worked with an organization that worked in Washington, and generally that's how I eventually find one of the young people, and then I meet them, and if I can tell they're honest, then I go forward with talking to them and bothering them for a long time, and getting invited to their house for dinner. Just a big high point. That's it.
How did they respond to you?
I don't know. How did they respond to me?
I don't think she counts.
Actually, at first, it gets a little annoying because you get asked a lot of questions. It's true. It's not because of Beth. It's just that when you're used to staying quiet about things, and like if you know a lot of things you're not supposed to know, you don't go ahead and just talk about it to everybody. So when somebody comes up to you and starts asking you a lot of questions, you hesitate in talking. But then once you get to know the person you're talking with, which was what happened with Beth, it was fun. It was fun working on the book. It was fun working with her. So I think that's like really how it goes.
That sounds pretty accurate. For the most part, the kids responded well. The Sarome, whose chapter I just read, at one point in the chapter, one of the lines is that Molly, who really helped him, he made this comment about he really didn't want to talk to some white lady because she wasn't going to understand him. So what he said to me the first day he met him is he said, "Oh, Christ, I got another white lady on my back." So that was the first comment. And every young person was different, but I think after they got over the initial skepticism that I wasn't going to take advantage of them, then everything was okay. But I think at first there's a little bit of fearfulness, and also some of them had done things which were not put in this book because of there was protecting them, and so they had to know that I was going to protect them, and there's a whole legal issue involved, and that took a while. But once the trust was developed and their families got to know me, then I think they just basically thought I was a little nuts, but true. True. Thank you.
You didn't have to do that.
Did any of them express fear from other gang members or former gang members by talking to you that they were going to be threatened by anybody else by telling them?
There were two people that were supposed to be in the book there were preliminary interviews, and one pulled out. He was in a very horrendous situation. His father had just been released from prison, and his mother had been murdered, and his brother had just been killed in a drive-by, and his father agreed, and then he realized that his son was going to be in danger because he also was in danger from the prison gangs, which are difficult. So, and then there was one other person who was pretty fearful and withdrew, but actually Patrick, who was in this book, whose name is a pseudonym, there's no frontal pictures of him. And he comes from a part in Boston which is not in the book. His face is not in the book, and everybody in his community, whether they were involved in any kind of business, said that he would have gotten killed because the community is very close-knit, and if you release any information at all, you get shot. So he was scared at the beginning, and then he kind of got over it, and he knew that he wouldn't face the camera ever. So that's how that issue was handled. That's it? I guess that's it.
Were you ever fearful?
I specifically chose this project for two reasons. One, because I wanted to give information, as I said, hopeful on former gang members. Two, I didn't want to get killed. And I knew that if I worked in really heavily gang-infested areas with gang members, that would happen. That wasn't the reason why I chose the topic that I did. But in answer to your question of was I fearful, the only time I was fearful is if I was somewhere very late at night by myself, getting into a car with a lot of camera equipment. But besides that, I generally knew where I was because of the kids would tell me where to avoid. And as somebody once said to me, you must have just been absolutely stupid. So I think it's paying attention to your surroundings. And there were a couple times where I was pretty scared, but for the most part, I took a picture once of a bunch of kids that were in a gang and a drug dealer, and it was one picture that generally I hold, since I'm not a news photographer, I don't have to photograph on site. If something happens, I have a choice to photograph it or not, and if I think I'm going to infringe on somebody's privacy or it's dangerous, I don't do it. In fact, Elena would tell you, I didn't photograph, I took one picture till she got used to me. But I took one picture in Dorchester, Massachusetts at the wrong time in the wrong place, and it was a little dangerous. But it was a great shot. But besides that, I really wasn't ever particularly scared. I was with some people that came with me that got very nervous once or twice also in Boston. That was actually the most fearful place for me, but I just wasn't generally scared.
What does the future hold? I mean, this is not a problem that's going to go away. It's something that's going to probably be with us for a long time to come. Social programs are not really addressing the gang problems.
I think you've got social programs aren't. Certain programs do. The problem is there's so many kids in gangs, and as everybody probably knows, funding gets cut and cut and cut. In fact, the young man who had the program that I mentioned with the rival football league, President Clinton was just in Salinas touting how well the programs had worked. Meanwhile, they're losing all their funding at the same time, and I'm speaking next month at the Monterey County Sheriff's Department, and they're desperate because although the deaths went down last year, they're shooting back up again. I personally don't have an answer. I think the problem is so huge that it's really partially a case-by-case situation of getting to young people like Elena, one after the next, and having people care. And I think a lot of people believe, and I do agree, that early education for little ones helps a lot, because I think it gives them a little bit more esteem and power to say no. The problem is if you're living in Cabrini Green in Chicago and you wake up in the morning, I don't care if 50 people told you not to join a gang, if you're walking by 15 gangs, you're sort of screwed. So I think it's a huge problem. That's why I spent 4 years doing this. I don't think there's any answers, but I think if more people could just help, one kid, it would make a difference. I also think that in different states, there's so many people that are trying to help the juvenile justice, the California Youth Authority, and kids get in, then they don't get educated, they get more involved, so there's all kinds of things that could be changed, but the country is large, the government is big, and the funding is small. So I think it's a tough call. I just think more people have to be aware, and hopefully more people will read positive things and think there's something that they can do. Bad media, in terms of promoting gang violence, I think is the single-handed largest problem in terms of spreading the message incorrectly. It makes kids want to join. It makes parents and adults incredibly fearful. I mean, I wouldn't want to go out and try to help a kid on a gang when I see what's filmed in the media. I wouldn't, it's way too scary. So I think, good media can help a lot, and bad media goes a really long way.
What do you
Can I
think?
say something?
The part that she said about the teaching the younger kids, I think that's very true, because the thing is that younger kids listen a little more than kids my age. Kids my age are a little more they're a little more hard-headed than smaller kids. And then the thing is that you tell us, no, don't do this, and just because they told you, no, don't do this, you're going to go ahead and do it. But teaching a kid from when he's young, through the years, they catch on a little more. Like my mom, she taught me about the streets. She didn't let me get too deep into things because she knew what could happen. Most parents don't know. Most parents think, oh, my kid is the best kid. My kid wouldn't do this, or my kid wouldn't be so foolish and go and get into a gang, but you really don't know that. So, like I said, parents have to listen to their kids, and as soon as they get an idea that their kids might be doing something, talk to the kids, make sure, that the parents themselves have to make sure that they understand what the kid is going through at school, what he's not going through. It all makes a difference.
So all the programs should be directed at kids.
It should also be directed at the
Family
parents.
thing. If I may say something in answer to your question, I've been working with kids, for a long time, and there's a little bit about my background, but I think every bad thing that happened to me allowed me to be able to be honest with her. She made her own choices. You don't have to have a child to help a child. If everybody in the community, without the funding, spend 1 hour a week with any child they came in contact with, just to be there and let that child trust you, that could make all the difference in the world in a child's life.
Good answer.
I have kids from rich backgrounds, poor backgrounds. I have a van full of teenagers every weekend at my house. They don't want to be home. Why? Because they get love and attention, and they get listened to. But they're protected. They're an environment. And kids need boundaries, and they need to feel safe. If a parent is involved in making money and providing shelter, you're better off living in the projects and getting the attention and the love. I know a lot of kids in the projects are not in gangs. Why? Because the parents are there. Their neighbors are there. Their friends are there. And that's what makes all the difference in the world, in a kid's life. You don't give up on a child like some of us were given up on. So you make a difference.
I think I'd like to read one little part. This is from the father and son who give their advice as to what you can do. And this is one of the big things that people believe in is outside extracurricular activities besides what Elena and her mother's been talking about. And so what he says is what would be great is to have a center with all kinds of kids that are court involved and change their lives, like the kids that are in DYS, that's the Department of Youth Services in Massachusetts. The trade they learn there is how to seriously gangbang. They get in prison or in jail, they learn more. So give that kid a trade to learn like bookkeeping or computers, something they like. They'll be a productive member of society. And one of the things that's brought up again and again is these kids want to be able to have a job, they want to be educated, and people think they don't. And if you talk to kids on the street who have been dealing drugs, or not all of them, they'd love to have a job. They just don't feel like they have an opportunity. So then the father says, that's a perfect example of intervention. Give them all a job, something that's marketable, train them how to do it well, and they could grow upon it and grow within themselves. And we could take that same kind of kid and put them through some courses where they learn teamwork, survival, and how to depend on each other. And then they can go home. So then the son says, so to all these kids and the ones that will read this book and the ones that are in it, there's mad love out there, just find it. Being a gang member is not the way for you to live your life. And another thing, if you do gang activity, be it just hanging with the group, you are down. If you want to get out, you have to get off the block and get away from your boys. And then the father says, the first thing I would say to these kids is, don't give up hope. You know you've got to believe in yourself. The bottom line is that you are somebody. I mean, it sounds corny, but it's true. You are the future of America, and don't forget it. America goes as you grow. And I think his advice is pretty good.
I want to thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Beth and Elena. You both will hang around for a while, answer any questions you might have to come up, sign books. All right. Thanks again.
You the first one, Brad? Oh my goodness, you were great.